In our study of the synthesis of yoga, Sri Aurobindo first brought us to the underlying oneness out of which the whole world is born, which sustains everything in the world, and into which every movement in the world returns, and in which all these various forces and movements find their perfect harmony. In such a oneness, living in it, Sri Aurobindo then took up the task of showing us how that oneness works out in the multiplicity of the world, taking first the most profound sense of duality that exists in creation, in a poise of consciousness that supports and a poise of energy that manifests, Purusha and Prakriti. The two who are so separate that it seems as if they can never be experienced as one whole. And yet Sri Aurobindo showed us through the previous chapter called Soul and Nature that they are both aspects of the one Satchidananda. The self, the Sat of the Satchidananda being is the Purusha, and the Chit and the power of consciousness of Chit becomes the Prakriti. And so these are two who are always one but play in a double movement. In our own consciousness, we saw how we, separating ourselves from our body, from our emotions, from our mind, experiencing ourselves as pure awareness, surrounded and formed or supported by nature, can change our relationship with nature through 6 different modes. We can be a pure witness, detached, simply aware that there is this play, my thoughts, emotions, instincts, body, or we become conscious that in the very act of our awareness, we support, we uphold. Not only we uphold, we can also select by upholding one thing or not upholding another thing. And from there, gradually, we awaken to the power of being able to guide, to play with the thoughts, the emotions, our body, as our nature, of which we are the controller. And from there, as the consciousness chooses to take the position of utter mastery and enjoying the mastery, this nature is ourselves expressed. And so subjectively, in our own human experience, we discover the unity of the consciousness, Purusha, and the energy, that is Prakriti. Having placed this as the foundation of this vision of oneness in duality, Sri Aurobindo steps back for a moment in the chapter we are now studying, the chapter titled The Soul and Its Liberation. Here Sri Aurobindo says that once you accept nature as yourself or as your own power, the whole sense of the yoga changes. To begin with, he says, we cannot pursue any of the ordinary aims of yoga that humanity, any of the ordinary aims that humanity has for its sense of purpose. And in this yoga, we can neither accept our earthly existence as it is, we cannot accept moral perfection or religious ecstasy or a heaven which is far away into which we will dissolve. Our aim is not only to live in the divine, in the infinite, but at the same time to be not apart from nature, to embrace, even to accept nature and embrace, as well as our fellow beings and everything which is otherwise mundane, in the same way as the divine accepts all these things. And so In our liberation, we rise to be free of ignorance, of bondage, weakness, but at the same time we accept the divine consciousness and the relationship with the world and with nature. And he says, with a divine power, a divine freedom, and a divine self-knowledge. This is the poise that we have to grow into, and this defines one of the most important characteristics of the integral yoga, which is that the yoga not only seeks a liberation of the consciousness, but it seeks in that liberation and with that liberation also a liberation of nature, an awakening of nature to her divinity, and the relationship that the divine has with divine nature to be our relationship with our own liberated nature. So it is towards this that Sri Aurobindo will take us as we proceed in this discussion. In the portion we read last time, there was a very powerful passage of the oneness of the divine finding itself out in the variations of its own duality. And this is the whole play of soul with nature in cosmic birth and becoming. And we saw that the whole creation is as if pouring out of the oneness, so that the one divine consciousness can play at the variations of itself. Now this idea is going to be extremely important, and as we proceed in the passages today, we will see how this variation is played out through many individual centers of consciousness. Each one of us as a center of consciousness, as a soul which has a nature, soul is a part of the divine. In each individual and the individual nature, we will find one of the specialized plays of variation being worked out. But this oneness finding itself in the variations of its own duality is the whole play of the soul with nature in the cosmos, but also now you will see in the individual life. Everywhere we saw the grand vision of one Satchidananda, whose unity is never destroyed even though it divides itself infinitely. And each of its infinite possibilities, it further works out in infinite variations. And each of those variations infinitely unfolding in further possibilities. And all of these things meeting each other and in perfect balance and relation to each other. The most shocking discords, or what appears to be as a shocking discord in the world, is still, Sri Aurobindo says, not a relationship of two different things, not a chance collision, but an aspect of the same one meeting the same one in an eternal relationship. And it is to this vision that we will always have to go back in order to be able to understand the true nature of the world and our place in it. In the last paragraph we read, Sri Aurobindo speaks of how this unity, when it plays out in the variations, works out everywhere and on every plane by an executive or practical truth of duality. So, for the purpose of playing out variation, if there was a single consciousness and a single energy, there would tend to be only a single experience. Except that as the single energy moves out, it is carrying with it the single consciousness, forming everywhere a unique expression of that consciousness. And each of these unique expressions becomes now a focal point or center for a new birth and a new movement. And so the result is as if many centers, an infinite number of centers bursting out from the oneness, and yet they are all the same oneness, the same consciousness, playing in the same energy. But the sense of this multiplicity can work itself out in variation because of this double poise that allows different focal points of consciousness, different purushas, so to say, around which a different kind of play of energy can center itself. So the underlying truth, of course, is that there is always the one eternal in one infinite conscious existence, and this is conscious. It is not mechanical, it is not inconscient. And I read now from the text, it exists eternally in its delight of the force of its own conscious being, founded in an equilibrium of unity. But it exists also in the no less eternal delight of its force of conscious being, at play with various creative self-experience in the universe. And so here Sri Aurobindo is showing us the nature of the consciousness of the One in two poises. It has the delight, first of all, it exists, and it is conscious that it exists, and it has the delight of its existence founded in an equilibrium of unity in which it holds itself. Now this we contrast with a different kind of delight in which it is conscious of its force of being at play with various creative self-experience. So there's one which holds a position of equilibrium of unity in which it seems to rest, and the other which moves out constantly in variations of creativity. And we'll dwell on these two. We will see how they are basically the same thing, but with a difference of emphasis only. So the first poise that he describes, it exists eternally in its delight of the force of its own conscious being, founded in an equilibrium of unity. What is this equilibrium of unity? If you look at the unity of it all, let's take the whole physical universe that we can see. Stretch out with your telescope all around, beyond the horizon, beyond all the galaxies that you can see, and still beyond it all, until in your perception you include everything in the universe. When you conceive of this totality, there are entire star systems which are being born, entire star systems which are being destroyed, gigantic supernovas, entire galaxies born and destroyed. But in the totality of the whole, nothing is lost, nothing is gained, everything is held in equilibrium. If here something throws out, there something receives. If here something breaks down, there something grows to take its place. If you look at a piece, let's say I cut myself out into the limits of this table, then I can have something which enters from outside, or something which from inside goes out. I can experience growth or loss. I can experience new appearance, something which was not there. Oops, it's come here. Where did it come from? Or it can be hidden. It's gone. Where did it go? But when you take the whole big picture of the universe, everything is in it. Nothing can ever leave. Nothing can ever grow which was not already there. And so when you look at the unity of it all, everything is in equilibrium. I will briefly digress with a sweet story of a king who, because he is king, wants to feel important and asks the wise man of his kingdom, all the wise men of his kingdom, tell me who is greater, God or me? And if I don't like your answer, then I will chop off your head. It makes the story more interesting. So all the wise men are afraid. They all say, we don't know, and ultimately the question goes to the wisest of them all. And the wisest man says, my lord, you are the greatest. And so the king is pleased. He says, but you have to satisfy me, explain how I am greater than God. So the wisest man says, you see, you are so great, you have the power to throw anybody out of your kingdom. God cannot do that. You think about it. God can never throw anything out of His kingdom because everything is in His totality, in His underlying oneness, unity, equilibrium of unity. But any piece which you cut out, yes, there the king can throw out, take in, so he's greater in a way. This idea will be very interesting because shortly, in another paragraph or so, Sri Aurobindo will tell us how important the individuality is. Because individuality can be limited, therefore it is capable of things which the cosmos is not capable of. And then we will discover the individual is as important as the cosmos. And in many ways, more important. But this story is a useful starting point for this idea. But here right now we are still concentrating on this equilibrium of unity in which the delight of the divine, of the Satchidananda, is playing at being conscious of all its possibilities in equilibrium of unity. On the other side is this thing which is taking place inside the equilibrium. Here an entire galaxy is born, bursting out. There another galaxy is fading away. And in this galaxy many millions of star systems, many new lives, new experiences being born. And the consciousness dwelling on this delight can focus on all the wonderful things that it can reveal of itself. And so, it is as if the other side of this equilibrium of unity, where constantly new things are emerging and we do not look at the equilibrium anymore. So it exists also in the no less eternal delight of its force of consciousness being at play with various creative self-experience in the universe. Between the first delight in the equilibrium and in the second delight in the creativity, what's the difference? If you think about it, it is in the equilibrium that all this play of creativity is taking place. In the play of creativity, there is always the equilibrium which holds it all together. They're just two different ways of looking at it. And yet, Sri Aurobindo throws in a very subtle pointer. It exists also, the eternal exists also in the no less eternal delight of its play. In the no less eternal delight is one of those quirks of language. You see, in the English, each language has peculiarities of its own and styles and a character of its own. The English language, we are told, is a language of understatement. That is, you can say something much more powerfully by saying it more mildly. So somebody, you've just done something wonderful and your friend looks at you and says, "Not bad at all." Now saying not bad at all, I'm not saying something deprecated, I'm actually appreciating you. Instead of saying, "Oh, this is wonderful," when I say not bad at all, you are actually highlighting somehow how much your surprise and wonder is. And so here Sri Aurobindo says, in the no less eternal delight, the delight of the creativity is no less than the delight of the whole in equilibrium. And in the no less is the suggestion that it is actually something much greater. And yet not saying it is greater because it's the same thing in a different way. So you see, the subtlety of the language is highlighting a truth without saying something which is false. In fact, the delight of the creativity is the greater delight, and yet it is the same delight. In the play of possibilities unfolding is the full purpose of this equilibrium. And the equilibrium is fulfilled because of the nature of the play. Now think of it this way. If there is an equilibrium, let's say a swimming pool, let's conceive of it like this, ocean of energy, swimming pool. The water can be flowing slowly and it would still be in equilibrium. Or the water can be in rapid, violent play of waves of storm and still the whole equilibrium will be present. Because there is the equilibrium, therefore the full bursting out of infinite possibilities is possible. And the delight of this is so much greater, even though it is still held in the equilibrium. And so similar to this double status of Satchidananda, we also, just as we ourselves are or can become aware of being always something timeless, nameless, perpetual, which we call ourself, and which constitutes the unity of all that we are. And yet simultaneously we have the various experience of what we do, think, will, create, become. Such too is the self-awareness of the Purusha in the world. So now if that is the way in the cosmos the divine has this double delight, it reflects in our consciousness also in this double awareness and delight. So here the first one is our poise in individual experience of the sense of the equilibrium of being, which is felt like this. We can become aware of being always something timeless, nameless, perpetual. Let's start with a very limited experience of this. You perhaps wake up in the morning from your sleep and you look forward to all that you will do in the day. And these are all the activities that you plan to do, you will likely do, but what are you now? You are just an awareness which is looking at it all. Describe the nature of that awareness. When was it born? Well, I woke up from sleep, but even before sleep I was conscious. It is the same awareness. Tomorrow I will sleep again, and day after I'll wake up again, and it will still be the same awareness. When did it start? When did it end? Our subjective experience is that there is no beginning and end. At least it feels like that. But this is still in the mind. And what is the nature of this awareness? Who are you really? You can't say, I am so and so, because that's what people call my body, personality. But when I look at all this personality will do in the day, the one who's looking at it is not someone with a name. When finally I move into the activity and I will meet people and interact, they will call me by name. But this poise in which I am before I move, it's not really named. I am simply aware, and that's all I can say of myself. And I will continue, even in the activity, I will remain what I am. This poise is possible to the mind, or a part of the mind that stands back from the thought and activity, because as we go deeper into ourselves, we discover there is such a consciousness which is timeless, nameless, perpetual, at a still deeper level, which we can call as ourselves. Why is it that we call that ourselves? Because everything else can be taken away from you and still you will remain yourself. Consider if somebody has an injury and his arms are gone, legs are gone. Do you end up being any different from who you were? Even if somehow your entire body is suddenly removed in a stroke, you as awareness will still be there saying, I just lost my body. So you are not these things. These things are taken upon you, or they exist because you are in them. But you are, if you take away everything, timeless, nameless, perpetual. And this is what we call ourself, which constitutes the unity of all that we are. It is in this that all these things, my arms, my legs, my head, my thoughts, my emotions, my actions, all of them find their oneness in this. You remove this sense of I, and all these things will fragment. Where are the thoughts happening? Oh, they're just wandering. Where are the actions happening? There is no person which holds it. So the sense of a self that I am is holding all this together. And this is one side of our experience. At the same time, we have the other side of the experience, which is that simultaneously we have the various experience of what we do, think, will, create, become. Such too is the self-awareness of the Purusha. So the double awareness is here. In the second awareness, what am I aware of? Experiences of what we do. I did this, I did that, and I look back in my memory to all the things I have done in the last few years. And those are the experiences of myself. I did those. And I have grown as a result, or the experiences were possible because I did them, and the experiences become the different side of my consciousness. Here, you think, you will, you create, and as a result of all this, you also become. I have become now more mature. I have become more capable as a result of all the experiences and all the things which I did, willed, and created. So somehow you have a sense of growth, even as there was that self which was unchanging, around which all the events happened. And so this double awareness actually exists also in the divine consciousness of the Purusha. And it is that which he was referring earlier, the delight of the equilibrium and the delight of the creativity in the cosmos. The whole universe is as if pouring out new possibilities of creativity, but in the process the Purusha experiences the growth. I am growing. Cosmos itself is growing, awakening to become more and more expressive of its divinity, and always in an underlying delight which is growing while still holding it all in equilibrium. So he has given the individual experience as a parallel so that we understand the cosmic experience, but also because to show that our individual experience is a replica of the cosmic experience. In us we experience this double status because we are a part of that. And this is going to become extremely important when we see the role of an individual in the universe. But there's a problem, there is a difference. This individual that I am and that cosmic Purusha, there's a big difference here. What makes for that difference? Only we, being at present limited and ego-bound mental individuals, have usually this experience in the ignorance and do not live in the self, but only look back at it or draw back to it from time to time. And this is our character. Contrast it with the other. While the eternal has it in his infinite self-knowledge, is eternally this self, and looks from the fullness of self-being at all this self-experience. So he is full in himself, flowing out into all this experience, but always living in the self. In contrast, and the differences are going to be extremely important. What's happening with us? First, we have a limited experience. And primarily, it is a mental individuality. When I say, I am separate from you, I am separate from this, who is this I? The one who's thinking. I can say my body is separate from this, but still the I which experiences separation is mind. If somehow the body were connected, I put on a pair of gloves and I stay using it long enough, after a point the gloves are my body. There's no real separation. The thing which brings the sense of limitation or separation is mind. So he says, being at present limited mental individuals and ego-bound mental individuals. So this is the second aspect of it. I'm mental, but my mind is bound in ego. I'm unable to break free from the sense of separateness. And the sense of separateness defines me. We are so used to the state that if somehow your boundaries were removed and your ego was released back into universality, you will suddenly experience a great fear and a great need to shrink or prevent that losing of yourself, which is the most common experience people have if prematurely they are opened to the universe. It's as if there's a wave rising from the ocean playing, if the wave collapses, poof, I am gone. That's how I will feel as an ego individual. Of course, the reality is the consciousness is never gone. You are never gone. It's only your boundaries and limits which are gone. But we have so defined ourselves in terms of our limitations and boundaries that removing that makes you feel as if you will die. The commonest experience when the ego faces its dissolution into the infinity is fear that it will die. I recall a very powerful experience narrated by a person whose whole life has been in a spiritual quest. And he said, I believe he was Buddhist. He was the head of an entire Buddhist institution eventually in his life. And he said that very early in his life, in his early teenage, he had a dream. Of course, it was a dream experience in which he was climbing a gigantic wall. There was a ladder and he was climbing up the ladder of this wall to see what is beyond it. And as he reached the top, he looked out and there was this pitch black extending into infinity. And it was such an intense experience, he had an intense fear and he woke up from the fear. And it was obviously his inner being which has already worked on the experience of nirvana, which was reminding the surface personality that this is the direction in which his life has to go. And so it gave him a touch of that experience which formed itself in the dream, where he rose to this and suddenly what? To the little narrow ego, which is unable to be conscious of something vast, something absolute even, it sees it as black. And it sees it as ending of itself, dissolution, self-loss, and obviously the fear to a still unready consciousness. But in the sense of, in the power of the experience, it was defining that it turned his life to the spirit and to that particular pursuit of nirvana for the rest of his life, because that was the choice of the inner being. If the same experience had been had in a different context, it would have been an awakening to pure light, pure love, pure bliss, and all infinite possibilities of delight pouring out from that, in which your sense of narrow individuality would also tend to be lost in its completeness. It would be the other facet of the same experience. It's all how one chooses to define or enter in relation with the Absolute. You could conceive of the Absolute as that which is beyond all limitations. So it is not this, not this, not this, not this, not this, not this, all the way up until something which is not, a negation of the whole cosmos, not cosmos, transcending everything. And so how would your mind conceive of it? No shape, no form, no color, no anything, which is what? Pitch black. But the experience is massive, because it is also not space, not time. So eternal, infinite, absolute, but as conceived in negations and therefore black. Nothing. That's the way your mind can conceive nothing. On the other hand, you could approach the Absolute from a different gateway. You say, this also is an expression of the Absolute. This and this and this and this and this, and everything bit by bit is drawn in. All possibilities even which are not being experienced now but which could have been. Everything from the past, everything that can be in the future, everything that is in the present and or could be in the present, everything is included more and more, and the delight of the oneness and the bliss of that unity. And as you grow in this way, all that is one, you grow into a perception of oneness and an absolute which includes everything blissfully and holding it all in love and completeness. and the experience is completely different. You will still transcend space because it includes space and yet it embraces from beyond space. It includes time and yet it embraces from beyond time. And you'll still have the glimpse of the Absolute, but as the source and origin of everything, rather than the negation of everything. It's just a different way of looking at and experiencing the Absolute. When you begin to view all spiritual experience in this way, you will find that each of these paths has taken an aspect of the divine and given to it a special, exaggerated priority. But you do not know the divine until you know all these aspects of the divine. And so I give this as an example of what it's like for the ego-bound mental consciousness to conceive of that or to enter in relation to that. Yes, we have defined ourselves in terms of our limitation and ego binding, so that is my loss or my immersion. As a wave, I will lose myself into the ocean of bliss. Or so it seems. In fact, nothing is lost, and we will see the individual is never lost even in immersion. And he'll explain how. So, at present, we are limited and ego-bound mental individuals, and we have this experience of being timeless, perpetual, nameless, and to do, think, create, become. We have this experience in the ignorance and do not live in the self, but only look back at it or draw back to it from time to time. And so what happens is, I am doing things, I am busy in my life, and every now and then maybe I read or some shock reminds me that there is more to it. And I step back and say, what do I really want? I turn within to feel myself in a deeper and freer poise. All of these last few years I have been driving myself to achieve this, and now that I have achieved it, I pause and I say, now what? How do you answer the question, now what? Get back to yourself from which you began the drive to chase after this. You get back to it, now what? What do I want? You step back. Or, I have spent all these years and suddenly now the whole thing falls apart. Now what? Again you turn back. Or I'm working, I'm very close, but I keep slipping, something is wrong, what should I do? I step back. What's the correction to make? So the sense of a deeper self is there as a reference to which you turn when needed, and then from which you're separate. You are not living in it. You are not self which is pouring out. You are a movement which looks back at self. And second, he says, look back at it or draw back to it from time to time. When there is a too strong a shock, I don't just look back, I actually find everything around me breaks down. My whole life has collapsed. I have lost everything. And it's as if at that point, I'm thrown into some deeper sense of I in a shock. You will notice it has happened to all of us at some time or other. When there's a sudden shock, sudden death, sudden loss, it's as if immediately a part of us becomes detached and we are somehow calm and unaffected. Why? Because the deeper self pushed forward its influence or drew you back into it to whatever degree you were able to. And somehow at that point it's like a drama happening, things are happening, you're doing your part, but from a poise which is clear, free, unaffected. A sense of an equality is spontaneously there. And afterwards, when the full impact or the shock of the experience fades, you slip back into your normal person. But if you could catch that moment or recall it, you will find here is your key to living in a deeper and freer consciousness while being fully engaged with life. You've been given that experience briefly. But this is all that we do, there's a gap. And he contrasts this with the eternal. While the eternal has it, we are existing in it. While the eternal has it in his infinite self-knowledge, is eternally this self, and looks from the fullness of self-being at all this self-experience. So there the consciousness is always rooted in its eternity, and all that happens is as if pouring out around it or from it. There is never this sense of gap or separation or being bound in the mental or the ego consciousness of limitation. He does not, like us, bound prisoners of the mind, conceive of his being as either a sort of indefinite result and sum, or else a high contradiction of self-experience. For him, everything is pouring out of himself, is himself becoming in form, while at the same time supporting beyond form. For us, bound as prisoners of the mind, we conceive of ourselves as the result of things which have happened to us. Because I have been through these experiences, I have become more mature. From my body's birth, I have become conscious and I have grown. This school gave me the education and made me what I am today. So we have the sense that the experiences form us as a sum total, or you are a kind of an indefinite result. Well, it gave me all these experiences, but I am not these experiences. I am just the one who is having these experiences. But it's still something vague, separate from the experiences themselves. Whereas in the consciousness of the divine, there is the full play of the experience as himself, not a separation. So this now he describes. What does he experience from that consciousness, which should be also our experience as we proceed in the yoga? An active force of conscious being which realizes itself in its power of self-experience, its powers of knowledge, will, self-delight, self-formulation with all their marvelous variations, is what we call Prakriti or nature in ourselves as in the cosmos. What is this? Force of conscious being. I am first, I am conscious second, third, I am able to act from my consciousness. So this is force of conscious being. There is being which is conscious, and the consciousness is a force to act. And when I can be a very good musician. How is this possible? Because first I am, and I'm conscious that I can be a musician, and being conscious, I can now activate the energy to be a good musician. And so suddenly all the energies begin to pour out. I will do this, I will do that, I will express this way, I will learn this way. And all the movement begins. From what? The consciousness which was already it, now becoming it. And so in the previous paragraph, the last line he says, the old philosophical quarrel between being and becoming is not possible to the eternal self-knowledge. In that consciousness, what you are is what you become. You cannot separate the two. In the human consciousness of mind and ego, you can say, I am a happy person, but I get unhappy when these things go wrong. So I am happy, but I cannot become happy as long as the world is what it is. If things don't become the way I expect them to, I cannot become happy. So the becoming is separate from what I am. This separation exists because the consciousness has limited itself and cut itself off from the self in which the continuity exists. For the divine consciousness, what happens? Active force of conscious being realizes itself in its powers. What is its power? I'm conscious that I am musician, I'm conscious that I am artist, I'm conscious that I am scientist, I'm conscious that I am child, I'm conscious that I am playing. And all these are powers of his own consciousness, of self-experience, experiencing yourself as an artist, experiencing yourself as a musician. And when you dwell upon that, I am artist, what is my art? So power of knowledge. I can do all these things, I can burst out in all these colors, in all these arrangements, in all these different ways. Self-knowledge. I'm conscious of myself as all this. Will. Now I move to act to express this bright color. Self-delight. As I move to express this bright color, I'm enjoying the movement of the color and its play. Self-formulation. As I splatter the color onto the canvas, I am the canvas on which I splatter myself as color. I have become the painting. Now this is how the divine experiences itself as it moves into universe, into becoming. You see here how, in a sense, our most creative acts are a small representation of this. The artist comes before his canvas, he lays out a canvas which is not himself. He looks at his colors which are not himself. But what does he do then? What is my mood today? What do I wish to express? Even if he's not conscious, if he picks up colors and starts playing, what is he doing? He is only expressing what he is feeling right now. You cannot express something which you are not feeling or which you are not yourself. Try that. You are, let's say, temperamentally a happy person, and if somebody says, now can you paint me a color, a painting that makes me feel the pain and sadness? If I am happy, I cannot do that. I have to put myself into a state of pain and sadness if I want to express it in the painting. Any way you look at it, the thing which you express comes from what you are within. And if I can put myself into a poise of pain and sadness, I can equally move from a poise of pain and sadness to a poise of happiness. They are all myself or moods of myself that I dwell on. So an artist actually can look into himself and say, what shall I draw out today? The joy of being or the struggle and suffering of being? They're both there. They are himself, but he can choose to align. So there is a power of self-experience in which you can choose what experience you have of yourself, and in it, the power of knowledge. I'm conscious of all this joy which now I want to express, and in the joy, I'm conscious of all the feelings of nuances of the joy itself. I feel so grateful to be alive, so full of optimism for the future, in spite of the appearances. Everything is an expression of the divine, and this is inevitable. This is an aspect I hold. But it's knowledge and power of knowledge to now burst out. And then what happens next? You will. I want to express this on my canvas. If now you stay in the experience, your hands will go and pick up the brush, pick up the colors, and make the movement. You do not conceive of what the form of painting will be. Rather, you allow the experience to play out and unfold in the painting. And when the painting develops, you will notice I splattered first a series of bright colors, then upon that I drew certain forms, and it's as if the painting became itself. When it's complete, I say, wow, it's such a perfect harmony of the different elements of it. Those of you who have done this, maybe writing a poem or painting, when it has come as an inspiration, you're surprised at what you created. If you had planned it out, you could not have conceived these details. And yet when it was happening, you were throwing certain colors, you didn't know what you were doing, or you didn't know what the ultimate form would be. The experience was leading you. That's because we are still in the limited mental consciousness. In the divine consciousness, it's as if all the possibilities that the painting could be in all its colors and shapes are all consciously known. And when it moves to manifest, it can still take this or that direction and play as it unfolds. But it is always aware. Unlike the human mind, which is not fully aware, it senses something and it follows what it senses until the form reveals itself. But still the movement is pretty much the same. Will leading to self-delight. I have the joy of now splattering this color or that color, playing with this form, and self-formulation with all their marvelous variations. And if I have played with certain colors and forms, now I look back, no, it's not enough. I want to play other variations. So I take a different material now and splatter it on the canvas. What about more variation? Can I do something else? And I try out different variations that I could bring in. So the mind still has to operate in limitation. What can I take? What can I bring for greater variation? Whereas for the divine, all the infinite variation is already within. Which one shall I draw out? And even as it draws out one, all the others are waiting behind as a crowd. At any moment I can say, how about a little bit of this and a little bit of that? And they're all waiting. Nothing is ever held back. All is present, only more drawn out or less drawn out. When you begin to dwell on this idea, you discover that even in a small movement like the flower blooming, behind this single flower that blooms is all possibilities of all bloomings of the flower. And at this moment, one of those possibilities has been brought out here, and then in the other flower, a different possibility has been brought out, and in the third flower, a still different possibility. And tomorrow, when a new flower blooms from the same branch, it will be a different possibility, all of the same flower being of the divine, never repeating itself, because it does not need to, because it always wants to draw out its infinite possibilities. Unlike I in the human consciousness of mind and ego, because I keep doing it within my limited capacity, there is a style. And you can say, oh, this artist, from the style I can say it is Rembrandt, because that's his style, that's his personality. Because his personality is limited within the frame of his mental being. Whereas the divine is infinite possibility, no frame, no limit. He can be everything. He can be equally Rembrandt as he can be equally Leonardo da Vinci, or he can be equally the bird on the tree which arranges pebbles as his form of art. And all of these are his artistry. The flower blooming is his artistry as much as the supernova bursting is his artistry. So the scale and scope and the infinite flexibility of possibilities of that artist is the universe. And even more than we can imagine of the universe, which is still waiting to unfold. We, being bound in the mind and body, have a limited frame in which we can express the art. But you see the similarity, and for now we focus on the similarity. In all art, what did you do? You expressed yourself. So self-formulation with all their marvelous variations, and then he brings in a series of words: inversions, conservations, and conversions of energy, even perversions. And all this play which he can express is what we call Prakriti or nature, in ourselves as in the cosmos. And Sri Aurobindo wants us to consciously play on both scales, our individual life as the divine working through us, and in the cosmic canvas, the divine working his full infinite power. So these variations, the marvelous variations, he describes inversions, conservations, conversions of energy, even perversions. What are these? We'll take a few examples. Let's say you have just played on the canvas a bright series of colors to express my joy. In order to highlight the joy and the brightness, I can put a contrary dark patch against which now the brightness becomes so much brighter. So you literally take the opposite of what you're doing and highlight that briefly in order to exaggerate what you're doing. And there's a kind of an inversion, the same thing taken in its opposite form and presented for the same purpose which you're doing. So you are throwing out a play of variations of flower, and in order for the flower to be highlighted in its bright white patch, you will have a backdrop which will be a different color of the green leaves against which the bright flowers stand out. And so you will find in nature the best way of highlighting something is by placing it in contrast to its opposite, inversion taking place. If you take now colors, every color has its complementary color. If you mix this color with its complement, you get a neutral. And so it's as if by presenting the complementary invert color, this acquires a greater contrast, a greater importance. In our human experience, my joy has to be contrasted with something which is, well, not so happy. Otherwise, my normal state of joy becomes normal, it becomes flat, loses its brightness. So it's almost as if life throws at you a few experiences against which now the joy acquires a greater importance. So in the variations there are inversions which add to the play and the vibrancy of the play, conservations and conversions of energy. So if you see the water flowing in the examples we've seen before, a river, the water flowing, whatever it may do, it may change form, it will become a narrow river, wide river, deep or shallow. It can be quietly flowing or bubbling in around rocks. Always the water is conserved. Somehow you never lose the water. So in all the variation there is an aspect of conservation, or there is the opposite of it, which is conversion. And it's very interesting, he never uses the word here destruction. Because in reality, in the divine consciousness, nothing is destroyed. Things only change form. So the water evaporates from the ocean, takes on a different form of vapor. The vapor takes a different form of cloud. Cloud takes a different form of rain or snow, which takes a different form as it settles on the ground, which takes another form of flowing water again. So you have series of conversions of energy. When you think about your own emotions, what are your emotions? Today I'm feeling a little unhappy, but now I shift myself to become happy again. What happened? The same energy changed mood, changed state. It converted from this state to the other. And as a result of the conversion, it is now behaving differently. If you go deep enough into the nature of the physical world, as science explores it, you discover that energy is never destroyed. It's always changing forms, changing the ways in which it is expressed. It becomes explicit or it becomes implicit. So you call it potential when it is implicit, or it becomes dynamic when it is expressed. I raise water in a tank, I don't see energy in it. But when I recognize the tank is at a height and the water can pour down and the water streams and builds speed, I can see the energy activating itself in speed and force of water flowing. But if I remove this picture and I see the tank in isolation, I don't see any energy. Everything is static, isn't it? So what you recognize is energy changes form, expresses in different ways, but it is always the same, conserved and converted. So this is the other aspect of the play. In the marvelous variations, there are inversions. And then there, in the flow of energy, there are conservations and conversions. Even perversions. So the perversion is when the water of the river flowing now turns upon itself and reverses flow. It goes in opposite direction of itself, as if in collision to go against. And that becomes perversion. Now you can see how this would take in the form of your emotions. I am happy to feel miserable. I'm feeling so miserable and I wallow in it. I enjoy this. And Mother speaks of the sense of depression as an acute egoism. You're feeling so good about yourself to feel depressed that you don't want to break out of it. But so much of our illness is really some form of perversion. When the thing is unable to flow naturally, to freely express itself directly, it reverses against itself. It is still the same thing, but now opposing its own truth. That becomes perversion. So if you have water streaming down in the river, you put a wall. What happens? The water hits the wall, rises and pushes back against itself. At least in that brief moment, it is a perversion. But perversions can never last, because they are a phenomenon under the overall flow of the water. It reverses for a while, but then eventually it has to be carried, because the deeper truth is something else. Now, the power of perversion, though, is to create some very unusual situations. In the water, for example, in the flow, you can put a channel which blocks the water, and the force of the water is directed against the current and made to lift the water one step up. Something very interesting has been done. A new possibility has been created. Now there used to be in India a particular skill which was taught, now it is mostly forgotten, where they would cut a series of channels next to a river, and the water flowing into those channels would be, because of its own force, would be made to turn up and rise. And through a series of channels in this way, the water was made to rise up the hill, using its own force. Very interesting idea. The same thing now we do through processes of conversion. You get the water to turn a wheel which pumps the water up. But you do not see the perversions, obviously. It is more a series of conversions used for other results. But here would be this power of reversing used for something else, a new possibility, some new creativity, some unusual experience. It feels nice to feel unhappy. What a strange experience. The child feels that, and let me explore this a little more. On some inner level, that's the choice. But then it's easy to do this. Because being happy, being expressed in my happiness, puts the responsibility of choice in me. And I can make mistakes, I can lose something, I can be blamed. But when I remain in depression, I withdraw from my expressed happiness, wallow in self-pity, I'm doing nothing. So I can't be blamed. I can't make a mistake. And so it's a kind of a perverse form of enjoyment of oneself, but which is contrary to your evolution, and therefore perversion. And yet fascinating for the possibility that it gives you to wallow in some kind of enjoyment. Another example of perversion which Mother speaks of is, somebody asked her, Mother, how do we turn pain into pleasure? And Mother said, but that is a perversion, why do you want to do it? Of course, the person had this idea, obviously from a misunderstanding, this, behind all pain and pleasure is delight. Perhaps he meant, how do you discover the delight behind? But the idea that you can turn pain into pleasure is a perversion. Because nature uses pain as a way of avoiding what is harmful, and pleasure as a way of moving forward to something progressive. And especially at the level of the instinct of animal, it is pain and pleasure which guide your behavior. The moment the animal feels pain, he avoids. The moment he feels pleasure, he chases after until it stops. So in eating, he feels pleasure, he eats. When the pleasure stops, he stops eating. If it's painful, he runs away and does not go back to it again. And that's how you train animals often, through experiences which are comfortable or uncomfortable. But that's the way nature can teach the animal to behave. If now you make pain itself pleasurable, what happens? Evolution is as if blocked. The thing which would lead you forward is prevented. Fortunately, perversions don't last. At some point, the deeper truth behind of which this is a warped expression, it will cut through, break through, and something else will kick in. So when I'm in my depression, it's a perversion. I'm enjoying the sense of being egoistic, egocentric, and in inertia, self-obsession. If I'm allowed to remain like that, nobody now panders to my depression, eventually I will try to reach out, get some interest from outside, go to somebody and say, you know what, I want to tell you how miserable I am, in order to sustain it. But I cannot sustain it if I do not get that support. So eventually, somehow the child becomes bored of his misery, because there is no reference against which he can continue it, and reaches out, goes out, something from inside pushes. So he makes perversions not as an primary experience, he puts it as one of the variations, even perversions. But they're not so useful, other than being possible. So I reread the sentence. An active force of conscious being which realizes itself in its powers of self-experience, drawing out itself. Its powers of knowledge, will, self-delight, self-formulation with all their marvelous variations, inversions, conservations and conversions of energy, even perversions. So this active force of conscious being is what we call Prakriti, or nature, in ourselves as in the cosmos. So in ourselves it's obvious, this conscious being, becoming force of conscious being, to do, to become, to act, is my nature. My thoughts, my emotions are this force of being working, moving out to act. My body, not so obviously seen as a force of nature, it's more like something from outside, but still, into the body, the drives of my nature are obviously from my consciousness. In the cosmos, the same thing on the scale of the divine being, conscious and power of his consciousness to experience and express in delight. That becomes nature, Prakriti. You will recall I mentioned earlier the root sense of the word Prakriti, because the English word nature is not quite exactly the same. It's the closest you have in the language. There is no other word for Prakriti. Prakriti, kriti, the root kr, is creating. It is the same, it's a Proto-Indo-Aryan root, they call it. So you will find it equally in the English language and various other European languages. The kr is creating, forming, and para gives to it a special focus, a special form or force. So Prakriti is that which particularly forms, intentionally expresses or creates, puts forward. So this is the movement, the sense of movement of nature in ourselves as in the cosmos. But behind this force of variation, now he goes back to the poise of Purusha and showing you how they're really one. From this you can go to that, from that you can go to this. But behind this force of variation is the eternal equilibrium of the same force in an equal unity which supports impartially. So first let's look at this. When you see all this bursting out and all this activity which is taking place, what is happening behind it? The same force is in an equal unity which supports impartially. I could throw a series of bright colors, or I could throw a series of dark colors. The force of my throwing is equally capable of both. It supports both possibilities equally. Now I may choose this over that, but the force itself is free to do both with equal force, with equal skill. When I look at myself in my own consciousness, I can choose to become this, or I can choose to become that. I could, at this moment, choose to lift the glass to drink water, or I can choose to lift the flower and smell it. But the force of consciousness behind both is equally capable of both. Now look at the cosmos. In the cosmos, the force that bursts out one whirl of the galaxy throws out here another movement of a galaxy. It's still the same force which can equally do this or that. The same force could equally spin the sun or spin a planet, or the same force could focus equally on forming the flower. If you think about it in these terms, you realize that the force behind is equally supportive or capable of forming the flower as in bursting out an entire galaxy. To the force, it does not make any difference which one it chooses. And so we come back to that very beautiful line of Sri Aurobindo, which I have quoted here many times, even recently. It ends with this as part of a larger poem, where he says, "The hand that sent Jupiter spinning through heaven spends all its cunning to fashion a curl." And in one of the aphorisms, he writes that the divine puts as much energy in building an entire civilization as he puts in forming a seashell on the seashore. If you think about it, the element of complexity in the structure of the shell has as much detail as the element of complexity in building, an entire galaxy or an entire civilization. The knowledge and the power required are equally the same for the divine consciousness, because each thing in the universe is himself in a certain aspect. Now we'll take another analogy to highlight this. Let's say you are a player on the stage. You have now to play the role of being a little rabbit. So you make yourself as small as you can, you put out all the nuances of the rabbit consciousness and his behavior, and move your nose, move your ears to whatever extent you can. On the other side, now you have to play the role of the big elephant who looks down at the rabbit. So you now take the position of the elephant, lumbering, large, and bring out all of his heaviness and static power, and his old wisdom, looking at the rabbit and thinking, what is this fellow doing? The skill with which you will express this role and the skill with which you will express that role is the same. The challenge for you to do this perfectly is equally the challenge for you to do that perfectly. The fullness of the energy of yourself that you put into becoming rabbit is exactly the same as the energy and its fullness that you will put to become elephant, isn't it? It does not matter what the role is. If you want to do it well, it will demand from you the same fullness of putting all of you with all your skill. And that's how the divine is in relation to everything in the universe. All things which are his becomings. Whether it is flower, whether it is the vase, whether it is a grain of sand, he puts himself entirely into it with his full skill, full knowledge and full power to form this. And then he puts them in relation to each other. The flower is made to be on the branch of the tree. And he put himself fully to be tree as he put himself fully to be flower, as he put himself fully to be bee who comes and enjoys the nectar of the flower. It's just the relationships which are changed. And the tree grows on top of a mountain, but he is as much fully mountain as he is tree. And he is as much the planet on which the tree grows and on which the mountain grows as he is the mountain and the tree and the flower and the bee. When you start viewing it this way, you have this extraordinary realization that behind it all, it is the same one, equally putting himself entirely in each thing. So behind this force of variation is the eternal equilibrium of the same force in an equal unity which supports impartially. If it was partial, then this would have more divinity than that. Or let's avoid the word divinity, more reality than that. So we can say the flower is as real as the bee. The force behind, the reality behind supporting is the same. So, is impartial, supports impartially, governs even as it has originated the variations. So it has originated all the variations of the flower expression and the bee expression, and it governs equally both. And directs them to whatever aim of its self-delight the being, the Purusha, has conceived in its consciousness and determined by its will or power of consciousness. So as it governs the flower, it governs the bee, and in each it has a different delight. The bee is happy to be flying, it is humming and enjoying itself the perfumes, and he sets up the relationship in his consciousness of the bee meeting the flower and enjoying the nectar of the flower, taking the nectar back to its nest and sharing it with its little ones. And that is an aspect of his delight. The flower has the delight of sharing its perfume with 100 bees or butterflies, and of being removed from the tree and being placed in a beautiful vase is also a part of its delight. So in the creative consciousness of the divine, the flower has all these different roles and relationships with the whole universe. The bee has all these different roles and relationships with the whole universe. The tree has these different roles and relationships. If you think about it, the flower has a perfect relationship with the bee, with the gardener, with the tree, with the air that flows around it. The relationship is such that the air picks up the perfume and spreads it, and the flower gives to the air its perfume. Every single object in the universe is included in the perfect relationship of the flower. Take the bee, every single object in the universe, not just flower, is included in the perfect relationship of the bee with the universe. Now think about yourself, your role, your life. Everything that exists in the universe is held in perfect relationship with you in your life journey. You take a step forward and that relationship is changing at each moment, perfectly held. You move a second step forward, everything is changing. I lift the flower and place it from here to there. All of the universe is adjusting itself in perfect relationship to adapt to this change. And all this perfect relationship and all its variations are held and determined in that consciousness by its will or power of consciousness. What an amazing vision. Every single tiny bit of the universe, which is himself, is held in perfect relation with all that is himself. And as it moves, all these relationships are constantly held in a single determinating consciousness, will, knowledge, delight. Of what? The Purusha. So you see, he's smoothly brought us from the delight of the movement and the consciousness and power of the movement to the consciousness of the Purusha, which is always there behind, supporting. But you never noticed when you became Purusha, when you were Prakriti. So I read this. But behind this force of variation is the eternal equilibrium of the same force in an equal unity, which supports impartially, governs even as it has originated the variations, and directs them to whatever aim of its self-delight the being, the Purusha, has conceived in its consciousness and determined by its will or power of consciousness. And now suddenly you are at rest in the Purusha, holding in its will the full conception of the universe. What's the difference between Prakriti and Purusha? Well, the Purusha is that poise of consciousness which is conceiving all this and knowing it all in his delight, and Prakriti is that which is pouring out the energy of this conception and forming in its delight. But that's the only way the mind can separate the two. But really it is one consciousness and one delight and one power of consciousness which has just taken two poises. Think of it this way. Purusha deploying itself in delight and energy is Prakriti. Prakriti coming to rest to support the fullness of variations in its delight is Purusha. Really no difference. In one continuum, being and becoming are really two ways of looking at the same thing. That is the divine nature, into unity with which we have to get back by our yoga of self-knowledge. So remember, we are in this fragmented consciousness, in the limited boundary of ego mind, where self is different from nature and there are all these divisions and gaps. Through the process of the yoga of self-knowledge, we get back to this divine nature and the unity in divine nature of the Purusha and Prakriti. So here what he highlights is, we'll go. We have to become the Purusha, Satchidananda, delighting in a divine individual possession of its Prakriti, and no longer mental beings subject to our egoistic nature. So at the same time as this movement into which we get back by self-knowledge, Prakriti, is this awakened divine movement, at the same time our consciousness, individual, gets back to the Purusha, that is the Satchidananda, delighting in a divine individual possession of its Prakriti. So this, you will see the duality of these two which were merged into facets of each other. Now in our consciousness we have to experience this double status. So what happens individually? When you say I am conscious, the I, which is the Purusha sense, has to become the consciousness of sheer existence and delight. That is Satchidananda. So in my I lean back into sheer existing consciousness, that is delight, which supports and possesses the individual Prakriti, which is this movement of my thoughts, of my emotions, of my body form, and the activities in which the delight plays out and unfolds itself in my limited nature. So you see in this experience, the way he describes it, yes, there is Purusha, there is Prakriti, but again there is no boundary separating the two really. It is one movement of Satchidananda flowing out or standing back to support the flowing movement. Delighting in a divine individual possession of its Prakriti. So the limitation of the individual experience is that you are a focal point, that you have a particular range or perhaps a practical boundary which is you and your nature, which is expressing you. That's about all. Other than that, there is no fundamental difference between that play of the divine Purusha and Prakriti, and within you the liberated Purusha and the divine Prakriti. It's only the sense of the scope, an individual experience rather than a cosmic experience. That's the only difference. And this is going to become extremely important, as I said before, because it will allow you to have an individual experience while somebody else can have another individual experience at the same time. But both are experiencing without this artificial separation in an expression of Satchidananda flowing and enjoying itself. Now, we'll still play on this idea a little more. What is your boundary of individuality? Where does your individual limit end? If you think about it a little, you discover it does not end with your body. It is only in the physical consciousness that my sense of I stops with the body boundary. Because I can move my fingers, which is me and my body, but then my fingers go and pick up a stone. And then I can throw the stone at another stone and move it. That's still my body's physical extension of becoming going out there. How far does my physical becoming go? I put on a light switch and the light fills the whole room. Physically, it's as if I reached out to activate the light. That also, my room space, is also my body's extension, but less and less complete. I can switch on the light, but can I change the color of the light? Well, not yet. But now you can buy a bulb which is able to change light color, and through a mobile phone app connect to the bulb and choose the color that you want. So now your switch becomes more fluid, the connection and the power of expression more fluid, and so I can switch on the bulb and make it green or red or blue or some color in between, or just make it white. You see what has happened between the old single switch on and off? Now I can make the bulb bright, dim, change color. Practically there's no difference. It's only difference of variation, richness of flexibility of my nature expressed. What technology has done is given you the means to amplify the extension of your consciousness and to make your personal space more expressive of you. But still there are boundaries, there are limits, physical limits to which you can go. When I go to my friend's house, well, he controls his app and the lighting mood in his house. I don't have the right to control. I can ask him, but that's about all. So there are boundaries which allow for many individual experiences of the world, each distinct and unique and yet shared in parts of them. So when the director of a movie creates the movie for your enjoyment, he is sharing his world experience, his creation, himself now as movie, with a large number of people. When he's playing a piece of music which is being played extempore, he is in relation with you. As he plays the music, he senses your response. And he senses how the audience is happy with it, or now I've pushed them to the limit and now they're getting bored, and I throw in a variation to surprise. And there's a continuous dynamic interchange between the musician and the audience. And after a while, the audience begins to participate and say, oh, wonderful. And there's the high of the experience, which he experiences also and shares with the audience. And there's actually a shared experience that's being literally curated by the musician, of something of the divine possibilities pouring through him and playing in the group. You see what's happening? The personal narrow sense of my Prakriti has now joined with the larger group identity or group Prakriti. And then we come back into our individual Prakritis and we move on, each changed by that contact. So what you're seeing now is something extraordinary happening. There is the focus on the individual. In the individual, the sense of the Purusha Prakriti can take its liberation and its diviner poise, and then each can have his own experience of the world and the possibilities of the divine enjoyment, which the divine has for the whole cosmos, but we have in our limited personal cosmos, allowing for many different cosmoses, so to say. It's no more cosmos now, individual experiences, and yet allowing in the larger cosmos the sharing of these. So, We'll come to this now in the next paragraph. I have anticipated what will happen next, but he completes this discussion. No longer mental beings subject to our egoistic nature, we in the Purusha Poise can join with the Satchidananda and experience our Prakriti in this liberated consciousness of a divine nature. So when we come back into the Purusha of Satchidananda, for that is the real man, the supreme and integral self of the individual. And the ego is only a lower and partial manifestation of ourselves. So when you come into such a poise of consciousness where you are one with the Satchidananda, he says that is the real man, the supreme and integral self of the individual. Now these are two important terms to look at. Supreme because it is your highest station as an individual. Anything less, moving out from there, you can be more. You can be more. And when you come to the highest that you can be, that is the poise of the consciousness of Satchidananda, but also integral self of the individual. So there is the individual which is my limited self. When I am body, I can only do this much. When I am mind, I can do so much more. I can conceive of myself to be so much more, isn't it? And then manifest of myself so much more. But how much am I in my totality? You go back to the base of the Satchidananda. Now I can be mind, I can be body, I can be anything else which is greater than mind and body. All the potential is held in that. So these two words, supreme and integral self of the individual. Here is the center from which the whole individuality and all its possibilities are actually held and deployed. So that's the true I. The ego, which is that part where I had the limited individuality and the limited self, the ego is only a lower and partial manifestation of ourselves through which a certain limited and preparatory experience becomes possible and is for a time indulged. So let's say you are in this poise of consciousness where you experience yourself one with the Satchidananda. What happens to the ego sense? Your body still feels itself limited, separate. Your emotions still feel themselves vulnerable. Your thought power is still limited. You are not mind, life or body. So in your consciousness you are free, but in this working of your personality on the surface, there is still the ego sense, which can be kept. And so he says, the ego is a lower and partial manifestation of ourselves. You take an analogy. Suppose I am interacting with fish in the pond. Well, the fish can't see me very clearly when I am outside the pond. If I really want to meet them, I have to enter the water and interact with them. But I can sit on the edge of the pond and put my hand inside and take some food and put my hand inside. And the fish comes to my hand and eats from my hand. What is the fish experience of me? Just the hand. What is my experience of me? The fellow who's outside the pond, who stuck his hand inside the water and is playing with the fish. Which is the real me? Obviously this. And yet, that's the practical me inside the water playing with the fish. You can say the ego projection of me in water, which the fish can relate to. And it's something like this. Your ego sense of personality is like a frontal projection for the sake of the body-mind complex of personality, through which I can act. And I feel it a little restrictive, but well, let's see how we can make it more plastic and more free. So you still have a focal point through which you can act in the world. Now I take this as an example, as a more extreme example. This body is my self's vehicle for entering the physical world. You knock out the body and the self will still say, I am there, I never moved. But the people who related to my body will say, he's gone. If I dematerialized it or it was knocked out, blown to bits, doesn't matter what, it's gone. But when I bring it back as a physical form, then the people who live in the body will say, he's back. So a spiritually skilled person or an occult power developed will give you the capacity from a subtle body to materialize yourself, engage with people, and then withdraw. As far as they are concerned, living in a physical consciousness, they'll say the person appeared and then the person vanished. And that's all that they can experience. So you need that support, that vehicle in the physical world to be able to interact in the physical world. You need the mental body in the physical fixed for the purpose of a human experience. But you are self, Satchidananda, behind. So the ego is a lower and partial manifestation of ourselves through which a certain limited and preparatory experience becomes possible and is for a time indulged. So what is this limited and preparatory experience? Having projected my consciousness into this focus in a body-mind complex, what do I do next? I try to make it more plastic, more evolved, more mature, so that more and more of me can flow and act through it. And that is the sense of the evolution across lives. From the point of view of the self that is supporting this series of lives, I am only trying to create a vehicle which can grow to become more and more expressive of my infinite capacity. The part of me that is sustaining the life and holding the focal point of these three bodies is the psychic being, where the absorption of the experience takes place and which carries it into the next, again deploying in a triple body, absorbing the experience, discarding the triple material, and again deploying a new one, and so on across lives. All the time building this vehicle which becomes more and more complete, through which more and more of my self-knowledge and my self-creation and the expression of my self-delight can now reveal through this. At a certain point, this whole personality will become sufficiently evolved that it can contain me fully. And at that point, the ego sense will have dissolved, the narrow, superficial I will have completely dissolved, and it will be purely me flowing as the true revealed divine Prakriti, without limitations, my full capacity of infinite possibilities, but operating through an individual focus. Because I created an individual through which to now express myself. So it is for a time indulged as a preparatory experience. But this indulgence of the lower being is not our whole possibility. It is not the sole or crowning experience for which we exist as human beings, even in this material world. Obviously now, because we have to bring that here. And so now comes the next paragraph, where the importance of the individual is now fully revealed. This individual being of ours is that by which ignorance is possible to self-conscious mind. You have to limit to be able to experience ignorance. But it is also that by which liberation into spiritual being is possible. If you did not have a focal point, you could not grow to become a spiritual individual being. You would remain always as the whole ocean of cosmic consciousness. So here comes the possibility of ignorance, but also the possibility of liberation into spiritual being. And one more possibility, the enjoyment of divine immortality. Now in your consciousness, from behind, you are always immortal. But in the individual now, you can experience and enjoy that immortality of the self in the individual. And so a divine immortality in a universe which is otherwise in a constant change of mortality. What an extraordinary experience. You see, for your consciousness to live in immortality, in the cosmic consciousness which is immortal, no big deal. Everything is immortal anyway. But for me to now enter a domain where everything is mortal, everything is limited, everything is in constant change, and to become a center of immortality radiating the delight of immortality, and Satchidananda lighting up the whole universe, so to say, with this immortal light and delight. That is extraordinary. But as an individual, and allowing for many individuals now to similarly become centers of immortality and light and delight, each of its own variation and color and enjoyment and different way of self-becoming. Now each one of us, as we become now centers of this revelation of Satchidananda, reveals a different aspect, a different color, a different play, a different shade and form of delight. And each one of us can now not only know our self-delight, but know each other as ourselves in other ways of self-delight. And the play of multiplicity of individuals becomes possible. So here Sri Aurobindo now turns to this. It is not the eternal, this individual being. It is not the eternal in his transcendence or in his cosmic being who arrives at this immortality. It is the individual who rises into self-knowledge. In him it is possessed, and by him it is made effective, the immortality. The Satchidananda. All life, spiritual, mental or material, is the play of the soul with the possibilities of its nature. For without this play there can be no self-expression and no relative self-experience. And all this is happening in relative self-experience, each one having their own different way of experiencing. And I'm just reading on so we get the full sense of the idea. Even then, in our realization of all as our larger self, and in our oneness with God and other beings, this play can and must persist, unless we desire to cease from all self-expression, and all but a tranced and absorbed self-experience. So you can say, from this individual I wake up to my cosmic consciousness and I choose now to withdraw and stay in my tranced self-experience. But then it is the individual being that this trance or this liberated play is realized. The trance is this mental being's immersion in the soul experience of unity. The liberated play is the taking up of his mind into the spiritual being for the free realization and delight of oneness. You see what's happened? An individual can now experience this trance, choose to remain in immersion in oneness, but what about the other individuals? They can continue exactly as they were and follow their own path. So what has happened is, with the possibility of an individual awakening with his own awakened nature, it allows for the many aspects of the divine play and the divine consciousness knowing itself in different ways to be now held at the same time in different centers in the larger cosmos. For the nature of the divine existence is to possess always its unity, but to possess it also in an infinite experience from many standpoints, on many planes, through many conscious powers or selves of itself, individualities, in our limited intellectual language. Many individualities of the one conscious being. Now you see where he is taking the whole discussion, something extraordinary. Each state of the divine of being himself, knowing himself differently, is an individuality. And each one of us is as if representing that state of the divine, knowing himself uniquely. And our journey of growth and self-discovery is that way of the divine knowing himself in this particular line of development, in that line of development, each one separate as if in the one cosmos. And yet we are each one himself in a different way of being. So that's why he uses the word individualities in the limited intellectual language, but they're always him, they're never separate. Of the one conscious being, you are us. We are each one of us the same one divine. put it another way, this person having this experience is myself having that experience. I am that person having this experience. We are each one of us the same one being having different experiences of self-exploration, self-discovery, and then meeting each other on this stage in the cosmic space. And so the rest of the paragraph we will see next time. But this is the direction now he brings the whole discussion. And from here he will say in the paragraph after, by knowing the eternal unity of these three powers of the eternal manifestation, God, nature and the individual self, and their intimate necessity to each other, we come to understand existence itself and all that in the appearances of the world now puzzles our ignorance. This is the key. To know these three and their true relationship and their necessity for each other is the key by which suddenly the whole universe will no more be a puzzle. Everything is now revealed. So this whole paragraph which I have read rapidly, we will review next time to highlight the importance of the role of the individual in the cosmos, in nature, and his true relationship with nature and with the divine. In fact, in the other large book of his, The Life Divine, Sri Aurobindo starts with this idea that these are the three things which are the focal point of all the philosophies and efforts of centuries of civilization, the true relationship between God, man and nature. And so we will perhaps see some of that text also, but this is the idea here. The individual being is the one by which ignorance is possible for a self-conscious mind, but it is also that by which liberation into spiritual being is possible and the enjoyment of a divine immortality. And now suddenly the sense of why we are here begins to become clear, and then we will see in more detail this relationship with nature and God. We are God in consciousness. We are nature in our nature. And so what is the relationship from the whole to this limited nature, from the one Satchidananda to our individual consciousness? We pause here and we can take up any comments or questions. You see how very smoothly Sri Aurobindo takes you step by step to something deeper, richer, insights, until suddenly you come to this, this is what it is. Or we can stay immersed in this beautiful experience, vision, perception of our true nature and our true relationship with the divine. Sri Aurobindo is not only explaining things, he is also leading you to glimpse and even experience. And so if you are careful, as you read, you begin to sense the truth of it, you begin to feel the truth of it, you begin to see the truth of it or touch the truth of it. And for a moment it feels as if so vivid, so real, so true, so complete. If you do nothing, your consciousness tends to slide back to what it used to be. But if you hold it and stay in it consciously, it begins to imprint itself. You absorb the experience and then you dwell in it, extend it into your activities. You begin to now look at everything that comes before you through these eyes, through this experience, through this feeling, until it begins to become your normal state. And then the experience deepens until it becomes established in its real depth. Then you never lose it. As long as it is a part of your consciousness which is perceiving, you will tend to diminish or lose the experience. But by dwelling in it, you allow the true base of the experience to fill what you glimpse and then to make it permanent. The sense of the Satchidananda, right now, for example, when we have this vivid sense of the presence, we are not living in the Satchidananda, but in the mind's orientation to it, in the mind seeing something of its truth is glimpsed and felt, and a resonance which is set up, which allows the real and full experience of Satchidananda to begin to fill your mind, fill your consciousness, fill your life, to whatever extent you are able to hold or receive it. Even at first as a pure reflection, later more and more as a substance that fills your consciousness, no more a reflection but a living and vivid truth, and then it deepens until it fills and replaces all the reflection and substance of your superficiality. It is your reality. And it doesn't matter how long it takes, because every step is a progressive delight and deepening in the experience. And so when we read like this, you see how Sri Aurobindo shows you and explains, shows you the way to get to it also, but also gives you the experience, even as a first touch, through which now the full experience can flower out. We'll continue this next Friday.